Welcome to the discussion we had with Sarah Fisher of Johnson & Johnson at the Henley Business Angels pitch event.
Now I'd like to really welcome our guest speaker today, Sarah Fisher from Johnson & Johnson. Now, Sarah and I go back, I think, at least 8 or 9 years, Sarah, in the, particularly in the corporate space that I've been working in and bringing startups. And I really admire what Sarah's been doing in J&J and Janssen and that over the years, both. And what she's going to cover today is corporate sort of startups partnering and investing in sort of startups, and particularly from her current hat that she's wearing around public health sort of financing.
So good evening, everyone, and it's an honor to be invited to come and speak to you today. Hopefully some of what I will briefly present may be interesting or a different angle than what you typically think of when we talk about Johnson & Johnson. By way of background, though, quickly, I am 18 years with the company across several different continents, but originally from New York City and now living in Amsterdam for the last 8 years. My background is probably the first decade was taking novel drug device software-backed combination technologies and introducing them into global markets. So first of its kind in the world, kind of class 3 PMA device tech. And then for the last 8 years, had kind of taken that sort of on the ground experience and pulled it into the front end and the investment was side. Brought over to our public health group 2 years at the request of our chief scientific officer, who wanted to take a look at how we could engage the private sector more efficiently and effectively in financing public health efforts, which are traditionally known to be financed by even contributions from people like yourselves, foundations, large multilateral organizations, and public pools of money. So what I'd like to do today is sort of introduce you to this part of our business and kind of give you a quick overview there. So for over a decade, Johnson & Johnson has been working on therapeutic assets as an effort to address some of the major global public health challenges, including some of our more recent work, as you all may be well aware of, given the news, around our work in the COVID vaccine space, some work we're doing around an HIV vaccine as well, and the overall global health security agenda. Next slide. We have a rich history of R&D collaboration and some investment partners, but if you have a look here at the ones that have been highlighted in this slide, from lab to last mile, you'll see the majority of these names are either foundations, multilateral organizations, or public funding pools that are already kind of focused or dedicated to the public health agenda. Next slide. In addition to our R&D focus, we have an equally strong commitment to access to these medicines. For the 5th consecutive time, we have ranked among the top 3 companies worldwide on this well-known Access to Medicines Index, which does evaluate our efforts again from lab to last mile. Next slide. This just shows a flavor here of the focus of our current portfolio. It doesn't include some of our more recent efforts for dengue fever, as well as kind of our access to essential surgery focus. So now from a financing perspective, global health does fall, as you are well aware, in the focus areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we all know is that traditional sources of funding that have been expected to bridge this gap are insufficient, particularly in low and middle income countries. It's already been well stated pre-pandemic that we were going to need to find additional sources of financing. Post-pandemic, as you can imagine, public budgets have been hit even harder, so this story is even more real than ever. So that brings us to what we need to do now, which is how we crowd in this private sector, which is viewed as being sort of this missing piece of the Sustainable Development Goal puzzle. How do we effectively and efficiently do that in a way that marries risk with return in a public health space? And for us as Johnson & Johnson, what role do we play as a private contributor, and how can we help move that financing agenda forward to the next generation of options? So in line with what you see here, at J&J, we're also thinking about how to leverage our Johnson & Johnson impact investing, our Johnson & Johnson corporate venture capital, so our JDDC group, our foundations in the US and in Scotland, to develop new financial mechanisms in line with J&J Treasury requirements that support our long-term impact agenda in public health. I'm just going to close this door for 1 second. I just opened. Sorry about that, Andrew. 1 second. So that's an overview of sort of the financing and investment lens from where I sit now, which is a much different one from where I've been in the past. The public health space, for me, even is pretty novel and nascent in terms of the financing agenda. And from many of the, what we might say, leading investment professionals, both in the impact investing side, as well as some of the investment bankers, we seem to be moving into sort of this next generation of financing and funding to support this agenda. And it's an exciting time in that respect, because Johnson & Johnson does, we believe we have the ability to kind of help now shape that and play a role in that market shaping effort, as financial regulations and financial mechanisms seem to be kind of on a moving into a, I guess, let's say, a new era of public health financing and investment. Now, Andrew, I don't know if you want me to do a little bit more about maybe how that relates to specifically where you started, which is now how we might be working in the public health space with smaller companies and corporates and startups.
Yeah, I think the really interesting overlap, I think, Sarah, with angel investors and with startups is we see, innovative startups in eye health. We had one recently where you can do eye testing and that on mobile phones. Chimera, who I introduced you to, can do, heart health monitoring. There's nutrition and food sort of type ventures we're sort of seeing. So interesting startups. And you've talked from a macro level now about how Johnson & Johnson engage. It'd be good to get a perspective from you from the historical part of how we've known each other, how corporates engage with startups, and how startups and angel investors should engage with corporates. Your perspectives on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the corporate side of things, the core business related efforts, I mean, there you clearly kind of have a path where you have a strategic agenda that's set by the core business, and then our corporate venture groups and our business development teams more act like the transaction support that are out scouting and supporting. Johnson & Johnson Innovation is another brand. We have a location in London, amongst a few other cities worldwide, where we have scouts, or what we call new venture leads, that are out looking for the latest and greatest and the best technologies that can complement and enhance and or fit an unmet need that we've identified in any of our strategic areas of focus. I think that is kind of a pretty standard corporate approach in terms of how you identify and look at different companies that might fit the bill. And I think, everyone knows that you may set that strategy, but corporates don't make many investments, right? So the number of investments we make, despite the number of companies we talk to, is quite limited overall. On the public health side, I would say, it's different in the sense that we generally start with our own R&D efforts on the therapeutic asset to address maybe an area of infectious disease, or leveraging our vaccines platform, which we've used for Ebola and then leveraged again now for COVID. So we generally let R&D lead the focus of our public health efforts. But what we find is that depending on what role we want to play throughout the R&D process and into access and distribution, supply chain, last mile, there are a lot of complementary capabilities that are required to get these medicines in the hands of the right people. Sometimes, given the specifics related to geographic focus, in the case of Ebola, where you're really talking, for the moment, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or now where we're really looking at, why global health security is so important, because without health everywhere, there is health is not really effective anywhere. So with dengue, we look at more of a global approach. With COVID, we clearly are on a global agenda. And what we see is that without the intervention of private parties the intervention, the support and leadership from public parties alone is just simply not enough. So you can read about that even with the COVAX work that's being done, which has, I think a very well-intentioned effort, but there's a lot of criticism about how well that's been able to get off the ground, and we obviously are participating.
Give the name of the company.
Yeah. So if you're a startup, if the angels on the call today have got a startup which is in that health space, public health space, sort of stuff like that, what would you recommend as the best way of engaging with corporates like J&J? What's the best sort of way of pitching or contacting them, and what's the best route in that in? Because it varies, doesn't it?
Yeah, for I can't say for many others, but for us, you can start. The global public health agenda is so broad, and every company is going to kind of still select within that health agenda the areas of focus for us. So those are pretty public and well known. So you can find out what our areas of interest are aligned. And if you do have a company that you believe is addressing sort of a capability, or even sending any early research effort addressing any of those capabilities, then it would be pertinent to reach out to even our innovation centers locally, which help to scout and feed through leads, or people like myself. What we do look at now, we're very strong in the mental health agenda as well of public health. And so, one area where we are looking for an example of an area where we would be looking for startups to fit the bill rather than our therapeutic assets. We are looking at decentralized clinical trials for large scale mental health studies, for example, in youth, in young adult populations around areas of depression and anxiety, as an example. We might also leverage technology that we have access to that's quite proprietary, that allows us to scout all over the world to look for any kind of capability that we think is pertinent to the utilization and acceptance of any one of these infectious disease medications. We might look for who is leading best in class in that capability in a certain part of the world, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, and we will look for local entrepreneurs in those areas as well to see who's kind of winning that race in terms of supporting in that capability that we might be able to then fund and support as well, to try to help that lower middle income agenda and the impact investing angle. So I would say, in the end, we wouldn't invest in a company in a lower middle income country just for the sake of it, just for the sake of allowing capital to flow there. We still are looking for best in class capability in areas like decentralized trials or remote monitoring, or any of the kind of even basic capabilities you would need around a public health therapeutic asset, where we take on the full responsibility for more of the R&D side of these therapeutic assets themselves.
Okay. No, I think you opened with a good point there that, corporates such as J&J, Merck, PepsiCo, I've been supporting a startup recently where they've got an open innovation funnel. The startup I've introduced them to have engaged with PepsiCo. They've exchanged NDAs, and now they're sharing parts in that. PepsiCo have done an open sort of incubator type call, and one of the contacts that Yorick put me in touch with has gained 125,000 euros through the program that they were running. That's free cash, not non-diluting money coming in, and they're now expanding in the States because of what they've had benefits from. Unilever Ventures have done equity investments in a startup, and I'm running a workshop on that next week, actually, which Kate has distributed to the group. So there are different ways of engaging, but understanding what the corporate wants is good.
For sure. I was just going to say, I think what you'll find also where you see on with Unilever and others is what we're finding now is that we're blending. We've started an enterprise charter, which brings together our very first Johnson & Johnson Impact Ventures group, where we've got 15 million of capital to distribute for very specific agendas around frontline healthcare workers, health equity, and some other areas. And so we have a Impact Ventures group, which is a brand new effort, even coming out of our global community impact, so more of our foundational work, but it is a venture effort, an equity effort, direct investment. And then you have Johnson & Johnson Development Corporation, which is our corporate venture capital group. And you have our public health group. And we're bringing those three groups together to start a new chapter or a new discussion around the role of impact investment for J&J and what that means. And so rather like going beyond that trade-off discussion of risk and return, saying that there are sub-commercial returns that are available in the market that we do need to tap into, that we do need to play into, particularly as it relates to public health. And how do we leverage this we're the longest standing corporate venture capital group in healthcare, over 20 years. How do we leverage our equity capability and our CVC capabilities for sort of this next generation of what investment looks like? How do we bring the corporation along in that effort? So I would say Unilever's, one of the best in class when it comes to kind of that sort of thinking, although in obviously a different category than us. But I definitely do think you'll see more and more corporates playing that kind of a role.
Yeah. Kate asked the question about how you've seen corporate investing change. I think that's been what you just highlighted there is a very recent change in this impact bit.
Yeah.
What's your view going back, 5 to 10 years ago? How do you see that it's grown up?
I would say even 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when we even started this idea of doing an impact ventures group, I'd say many people thought, what the heck is that? And still considered it to sort of be a CSR or an ESG or one of these acronyms that, it sort of seems like it's a charitable way to kind of put money aside. But I'd say what's shifted is that we see in the financial community that there's a shift in the perspective that philanthropic capital just doesn't cut it, right, to kind of meet some of these needs. And now we're at this peak of that momentum coming off the back of a global pandemic where we've all been sitting in our homes because health security is actually a problem. And so if we rely on philanthropic capital to address these issues, I think we'll all be very disappointed. And people do know that, we need to create sustainable loops of money that can finance these efforts so that it's not just everybody with their hand out, asking for the next non-dilutive grant or donor. And in that sense, I think what corporates are coming around to and changing their mind about is, hey, wait a minute, even the things that we thought were more of these kind of, let's just publish it on our charitable contributions reports. And they go beyond the tax deduction. They go beyond that now. And we've got to really figure out, are there ways that we can think about where we might have thought these things were loss producing or break even at best, but actually when you bundle them with additional capabilities, so just not your specific asset, but you partner with the Mercks and you partner with other people in your space, you create a portfolio of a program of an option of several, pieces of a program that become an option. Now you've got an investable and diverse portfolio of things that may attract a private investor to the table. So,
and in JJDC, the direct investment arm of Johnson & Johnson, what sort of investment criteria do you have when you're doing those sort of direct investments, which is sort of the question that Yorick's raised? What sort of criteria does that group do rather than the impact one you've covered?
Yeah, what we'll say, generally speaking, when you talk to somebody from JDDC, is you're always going to hear that the business and strategy lead first. And then depending on the sector, whether you're talking medical devices or you're talking therapeutic assets, we also look to ideally target a specific phase and timing of the asset. So, for example, in the medtech space, we do very limited number of investments overall, to be honest, both later stage and early stage. We've done a little bit more early stage, I'd say, in the last 10 years than we did previously. Prior to 10 years ago, we were always much later stage. You needed at least first in human, for example. We wouldn't kind of be before that time. Now, because of the introduction of software into the medtech space, you see us doing things a little bit earlier, particularly with some of the more health tech related investments. Whereas I think your standard kind of medical device investments still follow that same criteria in terms of timing. And in the pharmaceutical sector, you usually see us also get in late phase 1, early phase 2, I think, generally is where, we start to try to make some of our investments. Although I have to say the work we do with Johnson & Johnson Innovation, that's given us the capability to do a lot more work on research agreements. So very early stage research efforts that we can get involved with, put capital into, and do a kind of a watch and wait sort of a role. Mm-hmm. But there are clearly very strong financial criteria as well as strategic criteria that are required in order for us to make an investment in any time of company. And with Johnson & Johnson, what I have seen and learned over the last 18 years there are plenty of businesses that are viable businesses that just don't meet Johnson & Johnson financial metrics. So we may divest businesses that, become very successful mid-sized businesses. They just are not successful enough for the largest healthcare company in the world. So it is a different game, I think, you're playing at J&J sometimes than to say, okay, if Johnson & Johnson's not interested in making that investment, it doesn't mean that that's not a viable business. It just means it doesn't hit our particular criteria.
Yeah. Okay, last question from Kate regarding International Women's Day that we've just passed. How do you think the avenues for women into corporate investing have changed, or what's the perspective? From my view, it's a far more diverse and a much richer community than the traditional venture investing community. But what's your view, Sarah, as the
Yeah, I would definitely say corporate venture capital is much more diverse than other venture capital entities that I run into, particularly even in Europe. You tend to still see very few women represented in venture capital in general in the European space. And I think that's just an adjustment overall, that in corporations, generally speaking, you see more women playing leadership roles, whether it's in venture or not, but playing more leadership roles within a corporation, giving more opportunities to kind of help support that agenda. And I know Johnson & Johnson has very strong mandates and interest in supporting diverse candidates in all areas of the business. And so I've seen, we've had a woman who's leading our business development efforts in the medtech sector for over 20 years. And in our corporate venture group, I think we have more women now than we've had, historically over the past 10 years. So, and for myself, this role is a brand new one. We've created a private capital financing role in global public health. It's the first time we've ever had the role. So I'm the only one to have held it as a female. So it is changing. But I definitely do see that is a lot more real in corporate than it is outside of corporate in the venture capital arena.
Yeah. So, Sarah, thank you very much from me and from the whole group and that here for your insights, the overview of J&J and the specifics and that in the venturing space. So I know you're always very generous with your time in connection. I really appreciate your time you've given today, and you've always been supportive of the ventures I've passed to you. So thank you very much for your contribution today and what you've done in the past for us. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure to see you again, Andrew. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.